Hey everyone, my name is Charlie, and today I think I generally just want to talk about why I write poetry. Next Tuesday, the 26th of November, I have my first proper event at a library for Shepherd's Delight, my debut poetry collection that came out a year ago. I recently discovered that not a lot of people know that I released this book, which makes sense because I brought the book out on National Poetry Day. I didn't know whether I'd be bringing this book out, but I didn't finish Mistakes, Me and Murder in time. Also, because people have been looking at me for a few years and they don't really associate me with poetry. They know that I go to Poems and Pints and I've done poetry here and there, but they've always thought that it's just been something that is a bit of a sideline, not really something that I do as a poet. They don't think of me in that way. Or, actually, somebody believed that I thought that I wasn't a poet. And to be fair, I still don't know if I can give myself that title. There are people out there who say anybody who writes poetry can call themselves a poet. And then there are others who say that unless your poetry has been printed in a few literary magazines, journals and poetry and that sort of thing, basically the same sort of gatekeeping that goes on in traditional versus indie publishing. They decide whether or not you can call yourself a proper poet. Then recently I have been getting the question asked of me, why poetry? It's just something that happened by accident. And I'm still not sure whether I write poetry. I could not tell you anything about writing poetry or anything to do with that, apart from, for me, poetry is all about the way things sound. I like messing around with sound on the page. When it comes to the Our Doris books, actually any of my books, but specifically the first Our Doris book, was written to be read aloud. It was written to be performed. That's probably why occasionally it doesn't read like a standard novel, because everything I've ever written, I have been very aware of the way it sounds on the page. I read it aloud, I make sure it sounds the way that I intend it to read. That's why sometimes it makes it difficult when I get editors involved, because they've changed things to make it correct, and I appreciate that, but it changes the flow of the sentence then. Well, nobody ever wants a staccato sentence anyway, but in my mind, when I'm reading it, I can find the general rhythm. And so I change things based on that rhythm. Or in the past, if I've been writing a sentence and know that I need a 3-syllable word somewhere in that sentence for the flow that I want, I have just put brackets there, said what I want, and then waited until that word has come to me. And so poetry felt like a natural progression from that. Quite a long time ago now, I think it might have been a decade, if not more, that my friend Joy Winkler, who is former Cheshire Poet Laureate, is a poet in her own right of quite renown, led poetry workshops. And so I began writing poetry based on the poets that came to the writers group. And I wrote one called Lambs, which was all about the final time I ever went farming with my father. It's now called Ovine Gynecology in Shepherd's Delight, but at the time it was called Lambs. And I got longlisted for the Rialto Nature Poetry Competition. Then over time, I would just write more poetry about my experience as the child of a farmer who did not want to farm. I think when you read the book, you can tell which ones are from very early of me writing poetry and the ones that were more new, where I began to recognise that you could play with sound a lot more in poetry than you perhaps could in fiction. And I like that. Indeed, some of the stuff that I've been writing for the second collection has been based both on my background of writing the comedic monologue, so there are some more poems in there that lean more heavily towards the comedic aspect, but there is also me thinking more about the sound, and also there's been stuff in there where I've been looking at the poetry of the way in which people speak and trying to capture that as well, which is something that I've always liked to try and capture in my dialogue. But here within the poetry, I felt like it was a very good place to experiment with the way things sounded on the page and words next to each other. Indeed, quite a few that I've been writing recently have all been based on sound, and maybe they don't make much sense until they're read, but it's very much about collages of sound sometimes, and I worry that sounds pretentious, but that's the way that I've been seeing certain poems I've been writing at the moment. Another thing that happened was that somebody mentioned about doing a collection of farm poems, and so Shepherd's Delight took on this new quality of being able to tell my familial history and the myths from my family in poetic form. And it's almost like a memoir in there, or my family biography just condensed to 60 pages of poetry. I don't know why, but it just felt like the perfect form for that, for telling those stories. I don't know whether I'm going to write more about family history or history of my own. I don't know whether I'll include my own stories in poetry in future. I always wrote angsty teenage lyrics as a teenager and even into my early 20s. And I think that poetry was a way of doing that without being so angsty. I mean, obviously, we ain't writing terrible stuff about failed relationships anymore. It felt very natural for me to write poetry. And I don't think that there's a way of like knowing what a piece of work is going to turn out to be. I don't think it's like you can only write one thing, so like once you're writing prose, that's it, don't try and write anything else. Similarly, I don't think that people should try and confine themselves to one genre unless that's something that they want to do. You know, you want to write cozy romance books that for your entire career, then that is fine to do. You want to write fantastical novels your entire career, that is also fine to do. But I like to flit around a fair bit when it comes to writing, be that poetry, be that prose. I can do it all terribly. There isn't like one reason why poetry. Similarly, it's like there's no reason why I write. It's just something that has happened for so long that there isn't any reasoning behind it. Yes, I like messing around with sound on the page in poetry. Sometimes I think that it's also the best way in which to tell a story. It allows you to carve everything down just to its most complete essence, I think. You can be as experimental as you like in poetry. And one thing I also like about it is how people will find so much meaning in something that you might have thought was completely meaningless. I like the way that sometimes a comma can have so much power and people will spend ages just analysing where you put a comma on the page. And I like that aspect of poetry, even if nobody else considers me a poet. Do I consider myself a poet? Probably. I wrote poems now. But also, like, if I never have success from poetry, I don't mind so much because I still got the chance to experiment with the sounds on page and telling a story in a different kind of way. I particularly enjoyed it as something to do when it's felt like the prose or the novels have been getting too difficult. I just think, do you know what? I'm going to go aside and work on this poem and talk about these characters. That's probably why poetry. Hopefully in future, when it comes to poetry, I'm not so wary about doing events because I'm about to release another book and I've not done any publicising of Shepherd's Delight, really. I think it's just a worrisome one. Everyone says people who write poetry, release poetry, are really only doing it for love of writing because poetry doesn't sell. And I don't know how true that is. I know there's some popular poets out there, but I'm not, nor I doubt will I ever be one. But that's me, and that's poetry. If you write poetry, or you have some favourite poets, then let's talk about that in the comments. I hope that you got something out of this video, because until next time, that is all.